Chapter 14, Section 1, The Rise of Industry. Key terms: gross national product, Edwin Drake, laissez-faire, entrepreneur, Morel Tariff, Alexander Graham Bell, Thomas Alva Edison. October 21st, 1879, Thomas Alva Edison and his team of workers were too excited to sleep. For weeks they had worked to create an electric incandescent lamp or light bulb that would burn for more than a few minutes. For much of the 1800s, inventors had struggled to develop a form of lighting that would be cheaper, safer, and brighter than traditional methods such as candles, whale oil, kerosene, and gas. If Edison and his team could do it, they could change the world. Finally, after weeks of dedicated effort, they turned night into day. Edison later recalled, "We sat and looked upon the lamp, and the lamp continued to burn, and the longer it burned, the more fascinated we were. None of us could go to bed. There was no sleep for over 40 hours. We sat and just watched it with anxiety growing into elation. It lasted about 45 hours, and I said, if it'll burn 40 hours, now I know how I can make it burn 100. The United States industrializes. Although the Industrial Revolution began in the United States in the early 1800s, the nation was still largely a farming community when the Civil War erupted. Out of a population of more than 30 million, only 1.3 million Americans worked in industry in 1860. After the Civil War, industry rapidly expanded, and millions of Americans left their farms to work in mines and factories. By the 1900s, Americans had transformed the United States into the world's leading industrial nation. By 1914, the nation's gross national product, key term, GNP, the total value of all goods and services produced by a country, was 8 times greater than it had been when the Civil War ended. Natural resources. An abundance of raw materials is one reason for the nation's industrial success. The United States contained vast natural resources upon which industry in the 1800s depended, including water, timber, coal, iron, and copper. The presence of these resources meant that the American companies could obtain them cheaply and did not have to import them from other countries. Many of the nation's resources were located in the mountains of the American West. The settlement of this region after the Civil War helped to accelerate industrialization, as did the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Railroads brought settlers and miners to the region and carried the resources back to factories in the east. At the same time, a new resource, petroleum, began to be exploited. Even before the invention of the automobile, petroleum was in high demand because it could be turned into kerosene. Now, kerosene was used in lanterns and stoves. The American oil industry was built on the demand for kerosene. It began in western Pennsylvania, where residents had long noticed oil bubbling to the surface of area springs and streams. In 1859, Edwin Drake, key term, drilled the first well near Titusville, Pennsylvania. By 1900, oil fields from Pennsylvania to Texas had been opened, and as oil production rose, it fueled economic expansion. A large workforce. The human resources available to American industry were as important as its natural resources in enabling the nation to industrialize rapidly. Between 1860 and 1910, the population of the United States almost tripled. This population provided industry with a large workforce and also created greater demand for the consumer goods that the factories produced. Population growth stemmed from 2 causes: large families and a flood of immigrants. American industry began to grow at a time when social and economic conditions in China and Eastern Europe convinced many people to leave their nations and move to the United States in search of a better life. Between 1870 and 1910, roughly 20 million immigrants arrived in the United States. These multitudes added to the growing industrial workforce helping factories increase their production and furthering demand for industrial products. Here we see our map of natural resources. You see where the coal mining is going on in all the pink areas. And in the blue areas, that's where your iron ore is. So they would build all their steel mills and factories near the railroad tracks, so it'd be easy to get raw materials. And the sawmills were all up in the northern Wisconsin area, up in here, where all the lumber came from. You can see they built railroad spikes up there to go get all the lumber that was needed. Coal mining was, again, the pink areas, and that's kind of the foundation of everything, because they burn coal to fuel their industries. So the major cities always were near coal. Free enterprise. Another important factor that enabled the United States to industrialize rapidly was the free enterprise system. In the late 1800s, many Americans embraced the idea of laissez-faire, literally meaning let do, a French phrase meaning let people do as they choose. Supporters of laissez-faire believe the government should not interfere in the economy other than to protect private property rights and maintain peace. These supporters argue that if the government regulates the economy, it increases costs and eventually hurts society more than it helps. Laissez-faire relies on supply and demand rather than the government to regulate prices and wages. Supporters claim that a free market with competing companies leads to greater efficiency and creates more wealth for everyone. Laissez-faire advocates also support low taxes to ensure that the private individuals, not the government, will make the most of the decisions of how the nation's wealth is spent. They also believe the government's debt should be kept limited, since money the government borrows from banks is not available to be loaned to individuals for their own uses. In the United States, profit motive attracted people of high ability and ambition into business. American entrepreneurs, key term, entrepreneurs, people who risk their capital in organizing and running a business. They appreciated the challenges and rewards of building a business and making profits for themselves. In the late 1800s, the prospect of making money in manufacturing and transportation attracted many entrepreneurs. Savings that New Englanders accumulated through trade, fishing, whaling, textile mills, and shoe manufacturing helped build hundreds of factories and thousands of miles of railroad track. An equally important source of private capital was Europe, especially Great Britain. Foreign investments saw more opportunity for profit and growth in the United States than at home, and their money also helped fund the nation's industrial buildup. Government's role in industrialism. In many respects, the United States practiced laissez-faire economics in the late 1800s. State and federal governments kept taxes and spending low and did not impose costly regulations on the industry, nor did they try to control wages or prices. In other words, the government went beyond laissez-faire and adopted policies intended to help industry. Although these policies frequently produced results other than what had been intended. Since the early 1800s, the struggle between the northeastern states and the southern states shaped the economic debate in the United States. Northern leaders wanted high tariffs to protect American industry from foreign competition. They also sought federal subsidies for companies building roads, canals, and railroads to the west. Southern leaders opposed subsidizing internal improvements, and they favored low tariffs to promote trade and to keep the cost of imported manufactured goods low. But the Civil War ended this debate. When the South seceded, the Republicans that were left in control of Congress, and they quickly passed the Morrill Tariff, key term, the Morrill Tariff. Reversing years of declining tariffs. By the end of the Civil War, tariffs had nearly tripled. Congress also gave vast tracts of western land and nearly $65 million in loans to western railroads. The government also sold public lands with mineral resources for much less than their market value. Historians still dispute whether these policies helped to industrialize the country. Supporters of laissez-faire generally favor free trade and oppose subsidies, believing that tariffs and subsidies drive up prices and protect inefficient companies. They point out that one reason the United States industrialized so rapidly in the 1800s was because it was one of the world's largest free trade areas in the world. Unlike Europe, which was divided into dozens of states, each with tariffs, the entire United States was open to trade. The Constitution banned states from imposing tariffs, and there were few federal regulations to impede the movement of goods across country. Similarly, the United States practiced free trade in labor, placing very few restrictions on immigration. High tariffs, however, contradicted laissez-faire ideals and hurt many Americans. When the United States raised tariffs against foreign goods, other countries raised their tariffs against American goods. This hurt American companies trying to sell goods overseas. In particular, it hurt farmers who sold their products to Europe. Ironically, the problems farmers faced may have helped speed up the industrialization, as many rural Americans decided to leave their farms and take jobs in the new factories. Despite the problems tariffs created for trade, many business leaders and members of Congress believed they were necessary. Much of the Western Europe had already been industrialized, and few believed that the new American industries could compete with the large established European factories unless tariffs were put in place to protect them. By the early 1900s, many American industries were large and highly competitive. Business leaders increasingly began to push for free trade because they believed they could compete internationally and win. New inventions. Flood of important inventions helped increase the nation's productive capacity and improve the network of transportation and communications that was vital to the nation's industrial growth. New inventions led to the founding of new corporations, which produced new wealth and new jobs. Technology. Bell and the telephone. One of the most dramatic inventions in the late 1800s came in the field of communications. In 1874, a young Scottish-American inventor named Alexander Graham Bell, key term, he suggested the idea of the telephone to his assistant, Thomas Watson. Watson recalled he had an idea by which he believed it could be possible to talk by telegraph. Bell intended to make an electrical current of varying intensity transmit sound. Bell worked until 1876 before he succeeded in transmitting his voice. Picking up the crude telephone, he called the next room and said, quote, come here, Watson, I want you. Watson heard and came. The telephone revolutionized both business and personal communication. In 1877, Bell and others organized the Bell Telephone Company, which eventually became the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, or AT&T. Edison and electricity. Perhaps the most famous inventor of the late 1800s was Thomas Alva Edison, key term. His laboratory at Menlo Park, New Jersey, staffed by skilled assistants, became the forerunner of the modern research laboratory. Edison stood as a symbol for the emerging age of technology. Edison first achieved international fame in 1877 with the invention of the phonograph. 2 years later, he perfected the light bulb and the electric generator. His laboratory then went on to invent or improve several other major devices, including the battery, the dictaphone, and the motion picture. In 1882, an Edison company began to transform American society when it started supplying electric power to New York City customers. In 1889, several Edison employees merged to form the Edison General Electric Company, which is today known as GE. Technology's impact. As knowledge about technology grew, almost everyone in the United States felt its effects. Shortly after the Civil War, Thaddeus Lowe invented the ice machine and the basis of the refrigerator. In the early 1870s, Gustavus Swift hired an engineer to develop a refrigerated railroad car. In 1877, Swift shipped the first refrigerated load of fresh meat. The widespread use of refrigeration kept food fresh longer and reduced the risk of food poisoning. Textile industry had long depended on machines to turn fibers into cloth. By the mid-1800s, the introduction of the Northrop automatic loom allowed cloth to be made at even faster rates. Bobbins, which previously had been changed by hand, were now changed automatically without stopping the loom. Great changes also took place in the clothing industry. Standard sizes, developed from the measurements taken in Union soldiers during the Civil War, were used in the manufacture of ready-made clothes. Power-driven sewing machines and cloth cutters rapidly moved the clothing business from small tailor shops to large factories. Similar changes took place in shoemaking. Large factories began using new processes and inventions to mass-produce shoes. They could make shoes more efficiently than cobblers and sell them for lower prices. By 1900, local cobblers had nearly disappeared. Prices of many other products also dropped as the United States industrialized. Technology's impact also included improved connections among people. In 1866, Cyrus Field laid a telegraph cable across the Atlantic Ocean. This transatlantic cable provided instant contact between the United States and Europe. Another innovation was the radio. By the 1920s, radios had become common in American homes, and radio stations sprang up throughout the United States. This concludes Section 1. Section 2 coming up.